Welcome to the Sleepy Brainist, where we drift through gentle science to ease your mind. Tonight, we'll explore why your brain sometimes sees light that isn't really there. Soft sparks, glowing shapes, and colours that appear from nowhere. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Share your city or country in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy little map light up. If you enjoy cozy, curious videos like this, please subscribe, like, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a bedtime brain adventure. Close your eyes for a moment and notice that the darkness isn't pitch black. It's a gentle charcoal, a soft storm of faint speckles and slow waves that never quite sit still. Vision doesn't power down when the lights go out, it idles. Your eyes and brain keep working, running their quiet background processes, the way a calm sea still moves even under a moonless sky. That soft grey you sense, often called Eigengrau, isn't the world. It's your own visual system humming, a baseline song composed of tiny electrical whispers and the brain's best attempt to keep perception continuous. When light is scarce, your nervous system turns the gain knob up, like a microphone in a silent room, and the hiss becomes audible. In vision, that hiss is the delicate shimmer of darkness. Inside each retina, a thin living film at the back of your eye, millions of photoreceptors rest on alert. Rods, exquisitely sensitive to dim conditions, and cones, tuned to color and detail, never truly sleep. Even without photons, their molecular machinery occasionally clicks on by itself. Heat and random fluctuations can make a light-detecting pigment momentarily misbehave, as if it thought it caught a ray. One cell here, another there, and, spread across a vast sheet of tissue, these rare events accumulate into a statistical peppering of signals. It isn't a failure, it's the price of sensitivity. To catch the faintest star, you must accept a little noise. Your eyes accept it, and your brain learns to live with it. The flow of signals in darkness is its own kind of choreography. In daylight, photoreceptors respond by closing tiny channels and reducing the release of a chemical messenger, an elegant inverse code. In the dark, those channels relax open, and the transmitter flows more freely. This means that when you sit in a dim room, your retina is not silent. It is active, poised for change. Downstream, bipolar cells and ganglion cells, your eye's local interpreters, organize this activity into patterns that the brain can understand. They sharpen edges by creating center-surround receptive fields, where the middle likes one thing and the edges prefer the opposite. That push-pull architecture filters some of the noise, but not all of it, and the remainder becomes the subtle texture of darkness you feel from moment to moment. As minutes pass without light, another transformation unfolds. Dark adaptation. Photoreceptors rebuild their sensitivity, biochemical cascades reset, and circuits collectively increase their gain. Pupils widen, letting in any stray photons, and the retina's chemistry leans toward receptivity. In practical terms, the longer you stay in the dark, the more you notice the faint visual murmur. What at first seemed like blankness now reveals grain, soft eddies, and a grey tone that is not a colour in the world, but a colour born from the system itself. If you sit quietly, you might observe the brightness of this Eigengrau gently rise and fall, as if it were breathing with you. Even when your eyelids are closed, your eyes still perform tiny movements, drifts, microsaccades, tremors, so subtle you cannot feel them. These micromotions prevent the receptors from adapting completely to an unchanging scene. They keep the visual world from fading out. In darkness, they nudge the noise pattern just enough to keep it lively. The brain, ever a master of finding stability in chaos, smooths these fluctuations into something coherent. A patchy, random field becomes a near-uniform dusk. When the input is unpredictable, the brain's solution is to predict, to impose a sensible default that avoids hallucinating sharp edges or definite shapes where there are none. A calm grey is safer than a restless snowstorm, so a calm grey is what you perceive. Deeper in the pathway, the thalamus, the relay that routes sensory signals to the cortex, maintains a steady rhythm. The visual cortex itself, the sprawling sheet at the back of your head, has its own baseline dynamics. Neurons do not wait passively. They chat softly, forming loops of expectation shaped by a lifetime of seeing. If the retina sends a vague message, something somewhere, the cortex replies with a gentle, probably uniform, and the conversation settles there until evidence suggests otherwise. This is not deception, it's efficient inference. In the absence of light, the best guess about the world is that it is smoothly dark. You can explore this calmly. In a quiet room, close your eyes and let a minute pass. Notice that the darkness is not flat ink, but a living surface. Small twinkles appear and dissolve at the edge of awareness. If you focus hard to pin them down, they often vanish, slipping from conscious notice, because attention changes the gain and timing of the very circuits you are trying to observe. Let the experience remain soft. If you sense a gentle mottling or slow rolling clouds, that is your visual system's baseline revealing itself. If the grey seems to tilt toward faint colour, slightly bluer or browner, that may be the interplay of different receptor types idling together, each with its own probability of spontaneous activity. Over longer periods, you might sense that the sound of visual darkness has layers. There is a finer grain, a very high-frequency shimmer that reflects the random firing of many small units. And there is a slower ebb and flow, like shadows passing behind your eyes, shaped by larger circuits adapting and readapting. The retina handles the quick, local fluctuations. The cortex contributes the slow, global smoothing. Together they produce a darkness that feels uniform from a distance but intricate up close, the way a fabric appears solid until you lean in and see the threads. Consider how useful this arrangement is in everyday life. If the lights go out briefly, you don't want to experience a harsh, flickering void. You want a stable, low-entropy canvas ready for the next signal. By maintaining a gentle background, the system can detect real changes, however small, against the calm. The moment a candle is struck or a door opens to the night, the tiniest real photon perturbs the balance, and the circuits that were idling become directional, informative. Noise gives way to signal not by turning off, but by being outcompeted. You sense the world again because the world has pushed past the threshold set by your internal hiss. It is also striking that Egengrau feels subjectively darker than most physical blacks on screens or paper. That is because the brain's calibration point in darkness is not the external reflectance of a surface, but the internal equilibrium of its circuits. The reference 0 is built, not simply received. When later you open your eyes in a dim environment, the external world must surpass this constructed baseline to feel truly bright. This is why a phone screen in a dark room looks dazzling even at its lowest setting, and why a night sky far from city lights feels full, not empty. Your system is waiting at high gain. Any real input sails over the bar. All of this speaks to a central truth about perception. It is active, not passive. What you experience as darkness is not the absence of vision, but the vision of absence, a carefully maintained state that conserves energy, preserves sensitivity, and keeps the machinery primed. The slight grain, the soft tides, the gentle grey. These are signs that the system is alive and ready. When the first hint of genuine light arrives, all the filters and loops and gains will pivot, and the brain will trade its best guess for the best evidence. For now, in this quiet interval, noticing the texture of the dark is a way of meeting your own biology, patient, vigilant, and softly humming in the background as we drift onward. Imagine staring at a small, bright square, a red sticker on a white fridge, a green leaf framed against a sunlit window, holding your gaze steady until the color seems to thicken and the edges sharpen. When you finally look away to a blank wall, a ghost follows you. The shape appears again, but with its colors flipped, a quiet echo of what you just saw. That lingering image is not printed on the wall. It is printed on the state of your eyes and brain. Light leaves fingerprints, and after images are those fingerprints fading in slow motion, revealing the adaptive heart of vision. Your nervous system is always balancing between sensitivity and stability. Stare too long at one stimulus and the balance leans away from it. So when the world goes neutral again, the scales tip and the opposite impression rises into awareness like a mirage produced by your own recalibration. At the center of this phenomenon are your photoreceptors, cones for daylight color and detail, rods for dim twilight, and the pigments inside them that change shape when they absorb photons. With sustained viewing, those pigments in the stimulated region become bleached, not in the sense of being damaged, but in the sense of temporarily shifting into a state that responds less to the same light. That local fatigue reduces responsiveness along the very patch of retina that had been receiving the bright patch. When you look away to a plane surface, regions that were less stimulated are now relatively fresher, more responsive, and so the visual system reports a pattern that is the complement of what just saturated it. Because color isn't stored as isolated wavelengths but as balances across competing channels, the rebound appears as a negative of the original scene. Red becomes greenish, green becomes pinkish, blue becomes yellowish, yellow becomes bluish. It is the logic of opposition. Perception encodes difference. So when one side of a seesaw has been pressed down for a while, letting go sends you up on the other side. The opponent color system is a beautiful piece of biological engineering. Rather than having a red neuron and a green neuron that operate independently, the visual system builds axes. One compares long to medium wavelength activity, an axis that we experience as red versus green. Another compares short wavelengths to the sum of long and medium, blue versus yellow. A third axis encodes lightness. Stare long enough at a green patch, and the long-medium comparison dips toward one side, quietly normalizing that stimulus. When the green patch disappears, the comparison swings the other way, yielding a blush of magenta. Your brain's best guess for not green given the recalibrated context. The same happens for brightness. Fixate on a bright object, then gaze at a uniform surface, and a dark shadow of that object may appear. Fixate on a dark shape, and you may get a luminous afterimage. Vision is constantly subtracting baselines, and afterimages let you see the subtraction itself. There is time woven into the effect. Immediately after a camera flash, you might notice a positive afterimage, a bright rectangle, same polarity as the original, that quickly gives way to the more familiar negative afterimage with reversed contrast. The positive phase is like an acoustic ring after a bell strike, the photoreceptors and early circuits briefly echoing the input. As they settle, the longer-lived adaptation patterns dominate, unveiling the negative phase. If you close your eyes after a flash, the positive glow can paint your Eigengrau for a moment, then recede into a darker complement. If you gently open your eyes and look at different backgrounds, the afterimage can appear to change brightness, not because it changed, but because the brain is reweighing it against whatever texture or illumination it finds beneath. Afterimages are not only about pigment chemistry, they also reveal broader principles of neural coding. Visual neurons are most informative when they report change. On-off edges, flicker, contrast. Staring denies them change, so the system writes it into itself by adapting, reducing gain in the channels that carry the persistent signal. When the stimulus disappears, that reduced gain becomes a pattern of imbalance, a kind of negative stencil that the brain interprets as a stimulus with opposite qualities. Lateral inhibition, the way neighboring regions suppress each other, exaggerates the edges of the afterimage, making contours remain surprisingly crisp, even though your new scene is a uniform field. In that sense, afterimages are like footprints of attention. Wherever you asked your visual system to hold, it leaves a compensatory imprint. Try a gentle experiment the next time you're near a window at dusk. Tape a small cyan square of paper near eye level, sit comfortably, and fix your gaze at its center for 20 to 30 seconds while breathing slowly. Let your blink be delicate and infrequent. Then look at a blank, softly lit wall. A faint, warm glow will appear where the cyan had been, its complementary orange, shimmering for a few moments before dissolving into the background. Shift your gaze slightly and notice that the ghost follows your eyes. It is retinotopic, tied to the coordinates of your retina, not the room. If you return your gaze to the original square quickly, you may find it looks temporarily duller than before. The channels sensitive to its color remain a little tired, so your perception of the real square is filtered by the residue of your internal adjustment. The strength and duration of an afterimage depend on several gentle dials: the brightness of the original, the contrast with its surroundings, the size of the area, the steadiness of your fixation, and the state of adaptation in your retina. Bright, high-contrast targets that cover broader areas tend to yield longer, more vivid afterimages. Motion can wash them away by introducing new stimuli that demand recalibration. Texture in the background can break them into pieces. Even your attention matters. Focusing hard on the ghost often makes it evaporate faster, as top-down signals in cortex alter gain and sharpen the competition for representation. Letting it come and go on its own lets you watch your own visual homeostasis at work. There is also an architectural dimension. Afterimages can appear layered, as if hovering in front of a surface instead of printed on it. That is your brain's figure-ground machinery, doing what it always does, assigning surfaces and depths, even when the object is born from adaptation. If you place the afterimage over a pattern of lines, you may see it fill spaces between the lines, or align with contours that were never part of the original. This is not an error. It is the system's default of coherence. When a faint signal is ambiguous, bind it to the most plausible scene. The brain is biased toward the simplest consistent explanation, so the ghost gets folded into whatever geometry your current view suggests. Color after images can mingle with illumination in curious ways. Look at a green leaf under warm indoor light for half a minute, then glance at a page of a book. The magenta after image meets the paper's off-white tint, and your perception of the ghost shifts slightly, because your brain continuously estimates the color of the ambient light to keep surfaces stable. This color constancy computation applies to the after image too, which is why the same ghost can seem peachier under a lamp and pinker near daylight. It is a reminder that the brain doesn't present you raw signals. It presents you a corrected world, even when the object is an echo of your own adaptation. There are quieter cousins of the effect beyond color, brightness, and even orientation after effects. Stare at a bright window frame, then at a dim hallway, and you may glimpse a darker replica. Stare at a set of slanted lines, then a neutral grid, and the neutral lines may look slanted the other way. These are all flavors of the same adaptive story. Prolonged input shifts the balance of tuned populations, so the neutral case afterward is perceived through a filter tilted in the opposite direction. Even motion has its version, the waterfall illusion, where stationary rocks appear to drift upward after watching downward flow. While motion after effects involve different circuits, they share the principle. Perception is a report of differences from a moving baseline, not an absolute meter reading. If you wear lightly tinted glasses for a while and remove them, the world may feel tinted the opposite way for a short time. That's an extended, everyday after image at the scale of your entire field of view. Painters and lighting designers know this intuitively. They will sometimes rest their eyes by looking at a neutral grey to reset the adapted baseline, the visual equivalent of tasting water between flavors. You can do the same when browsing colors on a screen. Blink, glance at a grey field, then return. You are not purifying your eyes. You are resetting the comparator that lives in your brain. It is striking how gentle the boundary is between out there and in here. After images show that the line is negotiated, not fixed. You stared at one thing. Your brain adapted to keep you sensitive. The world changed. The adaptation lingered and briefly authored a world of its own. Nothing supernatural, only a clever system refusing to cling to any single input. This is why after images feel both convincing and fragile. Convincing because the circuits that create them are the same ones that usually deliver reality. Fragile because they melt as those circuits recenter. They are true to the machinery, even if they are not true to the scene. If you watch carefully, you can use after images as a slow strobe to reveal how perception stitches moments together. Hold an image, release it, watch its complement bloom, notice how background, attention, and breathing alter its lifespan. Each phase is a page in the book of adaptation, which you are always reading unconsciously. Seeing the pages turn makes ordinary vision feel more alive, more participatory. You are not a camera, you are a conversation, retina with cortex, present light with recent light, expectation with evidence, finding balance again and again in the soft half-second after every glance. And there is comfort in this. The world does not disappear when you close your eyes, and your perception does not freeze when the scene repeats. It flexes, guards against saturation, and resets to welcome the next change. After images are the sigh of that reset, a hush between notes that lets the melody continue. Hold a color, let it go, and watch the opposite bloom, your visual system turning the page, readying itself for what comes next. Letting the bright linger just long enough for you to notice the art of its leaving. Gently close your eyes and notice how a soft darkness settles in. Not flat, but alive with occasional twinkles, shifting webs, and small meteors of light that seem to spark and fade without warning. If you lightly, carefully press the outer corner of one eyelid, tiny constellations may flare and drift, as if someone tapped the night sky and set it ringing. These are phosphins, sensations of light born not from the world, but from activity within your visual system itself. Your brain is exquisitely tuned to interpret certain patterns of neural firing as light, and the retina, optic nerve, and even the visual cortex can be coaxed into such patterns by more than just photons. Touch, motion, electricity, and even charged particles can set those circuits humming. When they do, the experience is visual, though nothing in the room is glowing. The glow is being composed by you. Inside the eye, the retina is a delicate sheet of neural tissue, a layered network where photoreceptors talk to bipolar cells, which talk to ganglion cells, which send their messages down the optic nerve. Under normal conditions, photons change the shape of retinal pigments, altering ion channels, modulating the release of neurotransmitters, and producing a crisp code for "there is light here." But many of these components are also sensitive to mechanical forces. A gentle deformation of the globe, like the soft pressure from a fingertip on a closed lid, can jostle membranes, stretch receptive elements, and open mechanosensitive channels, leading cells to fire in patterns that the brain recognizes as visual events. The map of your retina is preserved all the way to the cortex, so a press on the temporal side of your eye often produces a phosphine toward the opposite side of your visual field. It is not the world bending, it is your retinal map being nudged. The shapes that appear are not random scribbles. Because the retina is wired into repeating arrays and center surround motifs, the signals that ripple outward when it is mechanically perturbed tend to form lattices, rings, radiating spokes, and honeycomb-like textures. People often describe shimmering grids, pulsating halos, or little fireworks that bloom and recede. If you move the pressure point slightly, the pattern shifts, following the geography of the tissue you're stimulating. If you release the pressure, the lattice dissolves back into the softer grain of darkness as the system recenters and the spontaneous firings redistribute into their usual background hum. Sudden motion can also summon phosphines. Rapid eye movements and head jerks produce brief shearing forces between the vitreous gel and the retina, tugging just enough to elicit activity in sensitive regions. That is why a quick turn in a dark room or a swift change in posture can sometimes create a fleeting scatter of sparks at the edges of vision. The effect is especially noticeable after you've been staring at a dim scene for a while, when your visual system has turned up its gain, amplifying small perturbations. In those moments of heightened sensitivity, even tiny mechanical events, like a heartbeat pulsing in quiet, can be translated into faint flickers near the periphery. Electrical energy can do it too. In clinical and research settings, gentle stimulation of the retina or the optic nerve evokes simple points or lines of light, demonstrating how directly current can stand in for photons. Farther upstream, non-invasive magnetic pulses to the occipital cortex, transcranial magnetic stimulation often produce cortical phosphins, little glints, arcs, or patches that seem to hover in space, shaped by the architecture of the visual brain rather than the retina. People with visual prostheses, devices that stimulate the retina or cortex to restore a form of sight, learn to interpret these electrically evoked phosphines, called phos, as building blocks of scenes, proof that the experience of light is the brain's reading of a code, not the code's origin. There are rarer, more exotic triggers. Astronauts in orbit have reported light flashes with eyes closed, streaks or bursts that appear in total darkness. The likely culprits are high-energy particles from cosmic radiation passing through the eye or brain, depositing just enough energy to excite retinal or cortical tissue into a brief, luminous report. On Earth, the atmosphere shields us from most such events, but the story is the same. If the right neurons fire in the right pattern, the mind sees light, no lamp required. Fatigue and gentle friction add another layer to the experience. When you're tired and rub your eyes, always lightly, never hard, the increased mechanical input, a small shift in ocular pressure, and a transient change in local blood flow can make phosphines blossom more readily. You might notice stained glass colors, as if the darkness has been painted with shifting jewel-toned panes. The colors are not inherent pigments. They are your visual system's attempt to label the perturbation with whatever spectral impression best matches the pattern of activity it receives. Sometimes the result is neutral white sparks. Other times it leans toward blues and ambers, depending on which pathways are stirred. Anatomy gives the phenomenon a sense of place. The retina is mapped topographically. Neighboring points in the tissue correspond to neighboring points in your visual field. This is why a tap near the upper nasal part of your eye produces a light in the lower outer part of your vision. It is also why the patterns can feel surprisingly stable, as if the sparks are pinned to a certain sector of the darkness. Even though you know nothing outside is shining, your brain's normal rulebook still applies, assigning location, and sometimes even a sense of depth to the phosphines, especially if you're gazing at a uniform surface behind closed lids, where there is little competing structure. The physics of your own circulation can also sketch faint pictures. You may, for instance, notice a slow, rhythmic brightening in the dark, a pulse-synchronized glow that appears with each heartbeat when you're very relaxed. Tiny pressure changes in the eye, and subtle motions of blood columns can modulate retinal excitability just enough to produce periodic glimmers. If you've ever stood up too quickly and seen a shower of brief stars, a momentary drop in blood pressure likely reduced retinal and cortical perfusion, and the visual system, flickering at its thresholds, communicated its state with a burst of sparks before settling again. History has its own accounts of these inner lights. Early natural philosophers described ocular spectra and experimented with pressing the eye at different angles to summon rings and radiating figures. They were mapping, in a primitive way, the direct relationship between the retina's geometry and the shapes of phosphines. While their methods were crude by modern standards, their observations captured a truth that remains useful. Seeing is a dialogue between incoming energy and a living, responsive surface. Press the surface and the dialogue continues, just with a different accent. You can explore the phenomenon safely and quietly. Sit in a dim room, relax your shoulders and jaw, and close your eyes. With the gentlest touch through your eyelid, not pushing, just a light, brief wait. Notice where lights appear and how they move. Then release and let the field settle. Turn your head slowly left and right. Notice if faint arcs or sprays wink on at the periphery, then go. Take a few steady breaths and watch how attention changes the display. When you chase a spark, it often retreats. When you soften your gaze, the pattern becomes more apparent. If at any point you see persistent flashes without touching your eye, or a sudden increase in floaters, or a curtain over part of your vision, that's a different story and worth professional attention. The gentle experiments here should feel calm, momentary, and easily reversible. A helpful way to think about phosphenies is as the visual system's false positives, but in a good way. To be exquisitely sensitive to the faintest real light, starlight, a candle in a far room, the system must accept a small rate of spontaneous activity that looks like light. Most of the time, top-down expectations and contextual signals dampen these blips, blending them into Eigengrau. But when you add a nudge, pressure, motion, a magnetic pulse, the balance tips, patterns emerge, and your perceptual machinery does what it always does. It converts a pattern of firing into a patch of experience. The mistake is simply the cost of vigilance, and the cost is small compared with the benefit of never missing the real thing. There is a quiet wonder in watching these sparkles come and go, knowing they are the signatures of living tissue responding to gentle forces. You are, in those moments, seeing the visual system see itself. No external scene is required. The scene is the system. The little wheels and lattices, the pulses and arcs. They are not messages about objects in the room, but about the readiness of your own circuits, the poise of a network tuned to catch photons and willing to confess, when asked the right way, that it can also make its own light. Let the darkness carry those glimmers, let them pass, and notice how easily the brain returns to its calm dusk, saving its full fidelity for the next time real light arrives, and the code shifts from self-portrait back to world report, poised to continue. On a bright, cloudless day, look toward the open blue of the sky, never at the sun, just the calm expanse, and a delicate swarm may reveal itself. Tiny, bright specks that wink on and scoot along short, squiggly paths, speeding up and slowing down as if they're following a rhythm you can almost feel. Blink once and they momentarily vanish. Keep your gaze soft and they flutter back, moving in little arcs and loops near the center of where you're looking. This is an entoptic display, meaning it's generated from within your own eyes rather than from the world outside. The sparklies, as many people call them, are intimately tied to your circulation. They are the visual signatures of single-file traffic in microscopic capillaries close to the central retina, a dance choreographed by blood cells and light. The reason the effect prefers blue is wonderfully practical. Red blood cells absorb short wavelength light efficiently, so under a uniform blue field, they dim the background wherever a column of them passes. White blood cells, larger and fewer, transmit and scatter blue light differently, appearing as brief, brighter spots against that darker backdrop. Because capillaries near the center of vision are just wide enough for cells to squeeze through one at a time, what you perceive is not a continuous river, but a dotted procession. Each bright dot marking a white blood cell or a little packet of plasma, followed by a trailing fluctuation where red cells shuffle back into place. Your retina does not know about cells, It knows about changes in light, so it reports a point that brightens and glides, fades, and is replaced, always tracing the filament-thin channel that carries the flow. If you pay attention, the movement has a pulse to it, literally. Many people notice that the dots surge forward in tiny bursts that sync with the heartbeat. With each beat, pressure rises slightly, pushing the column along, then eases as the pressure falls. Breathe slowly, and you may feel the timing shift. Faster with a deeper inhale, steadier as you settle. The pattern is not purely random. It's a portrait of your own physiology in motion, revealed only when the world provides a smooth, featureless canvas for your eye's internal script to be written across. The geometry of the paths hints at the eye's architecture. Just off the very center of gaze lies a ring of capillaries that supply the most detailed part of vision, where cones are densely packed. Because the capillaries are curved and branched like a tiny river delta, the dots seldom travel in straight lines. They wiggle, stall briefly at bends, then slip onward. Sometimes two streams seem to cross, a reminder that you're glimpsing a layered network in 3 dimensions projected onto a flat perception. If you shift your gaze, the entire swarm shifts with it, staying centered relative to where you look, rather than staying fixed to the world. A quiet test that the phenomenon is tied to your retina's coordinate system. The effect feels stronger when the blue is pure and even. The midday sky high above the horizon provides a good field, again, safely away from the sun, and so does a uniform blue surface on a screen set to medium brightness. Uneven texture in the background hides the dots because your visual system prefers external edges to internal whispers. Attention is a limited currency, and it will spend itself on real contours before it buys entoptic ones. When the field is smooth, the brain turns up sensitivity to make the most of scarce external contrast, and the faint modulations from within rise above the threshold of awareness. Inside the retina, the signals from these flickering dots weave through the same circuits that decode the world. Center surround receptive fields, tiny arrangements where the middle and the periphery have opposite preferences. Translate the passing of a bright spot into a crisp, on then off message. Lateral inhibition sharpens the report, making the specks appear small and well-defined, even though the underlying event is a flowing column rather than a point. Because the retina keeps a topographic map of the world and the brain keeps that map aligned as signals travel to the visual cortex, the dots appear in consistent positions relative to where you fixate. If you try to chase a single dot, it will often slip away as your eye movements recenter the map and as the background reclaims your attention. There is a quiet optical reason this works best with blue. Short wavelengths focus slightly in front of the retina in many eyes, a mild chromatic blur that makes external blue features less sharp. Paradoxically, that blur reduces distracting fine detail in the blue field, raising the relative prominence of entoptic contrast. At the same time, the S-cones, the photoreceptors most sensitive to blue, are sparser and wired differently than the red and green sensitive cones. The combination of absorption by red cells, transmission around white cells, and the particular weighting of blue responses conspires to make the dot's modulation stand out just enough to be seen. If you want to explore gently, choose a time when the sky is evenly lit, position yourself so buildings and trees are outside your central gaze, and simply notice. Keep your eyes relaxed, Hard staring invites fatigue and tears that can add glare. Blink naturally. You might see the swarm strengthen after a few seconds, then soften as adaptation nudges the gain and the brain reassigns its attention to the steadier facts of the scene. There's no need to force the vision. Like hearing a distant hum, it often becomes clearer when you relax your listening. Sometimes the display seems to arrange itself into faint lanes, like invisible highways. That impression comes from the branching of the capillary bed and from the fact that certain routes have slightly steadier flow. Tiny constrictions and bends can briefly bottleneck the stream. A larger white blood cell may pause, deform, then glide on, and you see that as a momentary brighten and wait. If you hold your gaze just 5 degrees to the left or right, you may notice the busiest clusters shift position around your point of fixation, reflecting how the density of supply vessels varies across the central retina. It helps to remember that these lights are not separate, ghostly objects. They are modulations of luminance across a small patch of photoreceptors, as the world's even blue is filtered by your own capillaries. Red cells with hemoglobin that drinks blue dim the path. A white cell passes, more transparent to those wavelengths, and for a fraction of a second the patch brightens. After it moves on, red cells refill the space and the brightness returns to baseline. Multiply that by dozens of capillaries crisscrossing a region the size of a pinhead, and you get a living stipple that only becomes visible when the rest of the world stays politely quiet. Many visual curiosities feel like tricks, but this one is more like a hello from your own anatomy. It is not a sign of damage. It is a proof of life at a microscopic scale. That said, it's useful to distinguish it from other kinds of flicker. The blue sky sparklies are tiny, fast, and always tied to a blue or very bright uniform field, mostly near the center of gaze, moving in brisk, looping paths that sync with pulse. Persistent flashes in dim light, arcs of light in the side of vision, or a sudden shower of floaters are different phenomena with different meanings. Gentle curiosity is welcome. Discomfort or sudden change calls for care. There is a soft satisfaction in knowing that the sky can act like a mirror for your inner rivers. The same daylight that vibrates in the air also threads through your capillaries and, under just the right conditions, sketches its journey for you. Once seen, the swarm becomes easier to notice in the future, not because it grows stronger, but because your brain learns where to look and how to listen. It becomes another quiet layer of experience. The world's wide blue above, and beneath it, your own delicate network keeping time, both moving together in a shared rhythm that makes simple looking feel deeper, without ever needing to name the effect as anything more than the gentle living pattern that appears when the canvas is blue and the eye is patient. On bright, even backgrounds, a clear sky, a white wall, a glowing computer screen, delicate shapes often appear and drift, like transparent threads, soft rings, tiny gnats, or cobweb strands carried by an unseen current. They seem to float with you, never quite holding still, sliding when your eyes move, and then catching up a moment later. These are floaters, and unlike the blue sky sparklies that sparkle and dart, floaters are slower and more languid, their paths curved and unhurried. They are not on the surface you're looking at. They live inside your eye, casting gentle shadows onto the light-sensing layer at the back, a private shadow play projected on your own retina. The interior of the eye is filled with a clear gel called the vitreous, a lattice of fine collagen fibrils suspended in a watery matrix rich in hyaluronan. Early in life, it is uniform and springy, but with time, the gel subtly rearranges. The fibrils aggregate here and there, the water separates into tiny pockets, and the once even transparency gains a faint texture. This slow phase separation, sometimes called vitreous syneresis, creates minute clumps and strands that are just opaque enough to interrupt the path of incoming light. When light traverses the eye, those tiny irregularities behave like dust motes in a sunbeam, except the beam is the one that reaches your retina. Each clump blocks or deflects a sliver of light, and the retina records a corresponding dark speck or strand. Because the structure sits inside the globe rather than on the retina itself, the shadow is soft-edged and moves with a floaty lag when your eyes shift, a signature of depth inside the optical cavity. The movement of floaters tells a small story about physics and anatomy. When you flick your gaze, the eyeball rotates faster than the vitreous can keep up, so the internal gel lags and then swirls, like tea continuing to spin in a cup you've stopped turning. Floaters ride these slow eddies. They jump a little in the opposite direction of your saccade, then drift back along a curved path as the gel's momentum dissipates. Point your eyes up, and the strands tend to rise in the field as gravity tugs them downward in the globe. Look down, and they seem to drift upward. This inversion is part of the entoptic charm. Your perception reflects a three-dimensional fluid dance, projected onto a two-dimensional screen of photoreceptors. Focus and pupil size modulate how visible the shadows become. A smaller pupil, as in bright light, acts like a pinhole, increasing depth of field and sharpening the projection of anything near the retina. Under those conditions, floaters can look crisper. In dimmer settings, the pupil opens, depth of field narrows, and the shadows blur into the Eigengrau. The background matters too. Uniform fields make faint shadows stand out. Textured scenes give the brain more interesting edges to track, and the internal silhouettes fade from notice. Attention is another dial. Search for floaters, and they often flourish. Shift attention to distant contours, and the brain's filters push the entoptic clutter back into the quiet. Not all floaters look alike. Some are short, dark threads that curl and sway. Others resemble small beads on a string. A common, distinctive form is a soft ring with a darker edge. This can be a shadow from the translucent collagen around the optic nerve head, sometimes noticed more prominently after the gel separates slightly from the retina in that area. As people grow older, the vitreous gradually detaches from its firmest anchors, a slow, natural process called posterior vitreous detachment, and a circular structure known as a Weiss ring may appear as a larger, well-defined floater. Nearsighted eyes, being longer front to back, tend to experience vitreous changes earlier, so those wearers often notice floaters at a younger age. None of this is an error in the design. It is what living tissue does. Reorganize, adapt, and quietly reveal its history in your experience of light. The shadow making is surprisingly elegant. The retina is not just a sheet of sensors. It pre-processes the scene with center surround receptive fields that emphasize edges and changes. As a floater's shadow slides over photoreceptors, the circuitry turns that gentle luminance dip into a small crisp, "there was a boundary here" signal. That is why fine strands can appear disproportionately defined against a white screen, even though the clump casting the shadow is translucent and delicate. The cortex, receiving this pattern, fits it into the best narrative it has available. A semi-transparent object near the center of gaze that moves with the eye and lingers slightly afterward. It feels real because it is real, just internally real, a world within the optical path. It helps to separate these shadows from other entoptic sights. The blue field phenomenon, the fast, bright specks that zip along curved tracks against a blue sky, arises from white blood cells in capillaries near the fovea and pulses with the heartbeat. Floaters, by contrast, are slower, larger, and indifferent to the cardiac rhythm, often taking seconds to traverse a small portion of the field. Another kin is the Purkinje tree, the branching silhouette of your own retinal blood vessels, seen when a point source of light moves across the sclera, or when a strong, narrow beam enters the pupil at an angle. That arbor looks like a delicate leaf skeletal, crisp and anchored, whereas floaters are freeform and untethered, more like seagrass drifting in a current. Seeing these differences, speed, anchoring, rhythm, turns the inner display into an approachable taxonomy rather than a mystery. Small experiments can make the invisible gently obvious. Sit by a softly lit window and hold a blank page at arm's length. Relax your gaze on the page, then make a quick, tiny eye movement to one side. Floaters that had been invisible often reveal themselves as pale strands that lag behind, then settle. If you blink and they shift, they are likely close to the retina. If they hardly budge with a blink, they may sit deeper in the geo. Tilt your head slightly and watch the slow reassortment. None of this needs effort. Curiosity and softness show more than scrutiny does. If you look away to a textured object, a bookshelf, a plant, the shapes recede, the brain happily spending its attention budget on the external world again. There is a psychological rhythm to the way floaters enter consciousness. At first encounter, they can feel intrusive, precisely because they move with you and cannot be brushed away. Over days and weeks, most people's awareness adapts. The visual system learns to discount the familiar shadows, relegating them to the background the way it tunes out the faint noise of a room. This neural habituation is not denial, it is efficiency. Perception prioritizes changes that matter for action and safety, and floating, repeatable silhouettes that carry no consequence gradually slip beneath that threshold. On days of fatigue, stress, or prolonged screen time, attention drifts inward and they seem louder. After rest or a walk among contrast-rich scenes, they quiet again. Floaters also track the microscale weather inside the eye. After long periods of looking down, they may settle, clustering in one part of the field. After a few lively saccades while reading or scanning the horizon, they disperse. Hydration, posture, and time of day may subtly sway how the gel behaves, though they do not create or erase the structures themselves. The sense that floaters multiply when you look for them is partly true in a cognitive way. Searching sharpens sensitivity, revealing faint ones that habit normally hides. When you stop looking, you don't lose them. You regain the bliss of not needing them. Every so often, narratives wander from curiosity to care, and it is worth keeping a gentle boundary. Gradual, familiar floaters that appear mostly against bright, even fields, and behave in the slow, lagging way described here, are a normal part of many visual lives. A sudden shower of new floaters, persistent flashing lights in dim conditions, or a dark curtain drifting across part of the field are different stories and deserve timely evaluation because they can signal traction on the retina rather than innocuous clumps in the gel. The distinction does not dampen the wonder of the entoptic show. It simply honors that the same pathways that let you see the harmless also faithfully report the urgent. Artists and photographers sometimes leverage the lesson that floaters teach. When a scene is overexposed or uniformly bright, tiny imperfections stand out. Add a little texture, and the eye forgives the specks. In perception, as in images, contrast budgets, attention. The brain's predictive habits complete the picture. It prefers coherent surfaces and stable edges, so it edits stray internal silhouettes out of awareness when external structure is abundant. That is why stepping outside into the pattern world of leaves and walls and faces so quickly makes the floaters recede, and why they return in the open sky to say hello when the canvas is blank again. There is a quiet intimacy in knowing that part of what you see comes from the architecture of seeing itself. Floaters are not intruders from elsewhere. They are reminders that vision is a collaboration between light and living tissue, optics and fluid, world and self. The cobweb strands and drifting rings are the mild handwriting of the vitreous on the retina, usually unread until a field of light turns the ink visible. Notice them when they appear, watch their slow choreography, and let them pass. The brain will, as it always does, blend the inner and the outer into a single seamless picture, ready for whatever the next glance will bring. There is a quiet miracle sitting inside every eye, a place where sight should simply fail. Where the optic nerve exits the retina, there are no photoreceptors at all. No rods, no cones. Just a perfectly ordinary patch of biological plumbing that cannot sense light. If your eye were a camera, this would be an unforgivable flaw, a permanent hole in the film. Yet you do not walk around seeing a black coin cut from your visual field. Instead, you see continuity. Texture rolls on, lines continue, colors spread smoothly across the place that receives no photons. The reason is not denial, but workmanship. The brain fills in what's missing with quiet confidence, using information from around the gap and from its own deeply learned expectations about how the world tends to be. You do not notice the fix because the fix is the default. You can invite this to reveal itself with a simple, gentle experiment. Draw a small cross on the left side of a note card and a small dot on the right. Close your right eye, hold the card at arm's length, and stare softly at the cross with your left eye. Now, without shifting gaze, slowly bring the card closer. At a particular distance, the dot will disappear, not because it faded, but because its image fell onto the blind spot. If you draw a thin horizontal line that passes through the dot and across the card, you will notice something delightful. When the dot vanishes, the line often looks continuous, as if the missing segment had been quietly repaired. The brain does not paste a black patch. It interpolates what belongs there based on what surrounds the gap. That polite act of completion is not a special trick reserved for blind spots. It is a general strategy for dealing with missing, noisy, or ambiguous data everywhere in vision. Completion wears many styles. Sometimes it is a modal. Your brain represents a surface or edge continuing behind something without summoning a bright new surface in front. A fence slat passing in front of a car does not convince you that the car is sliced into pieces. Your perceptual system binds the visible fragments into a continuous object behind the occluder. Other times, completion becomes modal. The system conjures an actual vivid contour or surface that seems to float in front, even though no corresponding light reaches your eye. The classic Canissa triangle is a portrait of that. 3 Pac-Man shapes, and 3 corner brackets arrange themselves so that a crisp, bright triangle appears to hover over them. No part of the central triangle is drawn, yet you see its edges as if they were cut with a knife. The brain infers a border from hints, edge alignments, T-junctions, and the logic of occlusion, and then paints an illusory surface that respects that border. It is not superstition. It is a mathematically efficient way to interpret the most probable scene that could have produced the fragments you received. Edges are privileged citizens in this story. Early visual neurons tune themselves to local contrasts, places where brightness or color changes abruptly across space. Those detectors, arranged in oriented receptive fields, send a chorus of "there is a boundary here" to slightly higher areas that assemble the fragments into longer contours and surfaces. When evidence is strong, boundaries are crisp and assigned to real objects. When evidence is suggestive but incomplete, the same machinery happily continues the line across gaps, guided by principles like good continuation. Curves prefer to keep curving smoothly rather than break, and closure shapes tend to complete themselves. This is why a dashed line still reads as a line, why a logo drawn in fragments still feels complete, and why, when a small portion of a texture is occluded by your blind spot, the texture returns seamlessly on the other side. Brightness and color are filled in from borders inward like paint spreading inside a fenced garden. The Craik-O'Brien-Cornsuite illusion shows this elegantly. Place 2 large regions of identical average luminance side by side, but put a narrow gradient at their shared edge. One side ramps slightly up, the other down. The eye reports that the entire left region is darker and the entire right region lighter, even though a photometer would disagree. The brain takes the edge as authentic and infers the surfaces that best explain it, then propagates that interpretation across the interiors. The watercolor illusion and neon color spreading play similar music. Faint colored lines around a shape lead to the impression of a delicate wash of color filling the whole area. You are not hallucinating randomly. You are seeing a surface computed from contour evidence. This same spreading helps explain why the blind spot blends into its surroundings instead of standing out. The borders of whatever texture, color, or gradient lies around that retinal void seed, a filling-in process that gently diffuses across the hole in the map, guided by the assumption that surfaces are typically continuous unless there is a good reason to think otherwise. In neural terms, activity representing a surface can diffuse laterally across a retinotopic sheet of cortex when no contradictory boundary signal interrupts it. Where boundaries exist, real edges in the input, lateral inhibition and boundary detecting units fence the diffusion, stopping the paint at the right place. Where no evidence arrives, as in the blind spot, the paint flows through. Fixation offers another window into completion. If you hold your gaze on a single point for long enough, faint features in the periphery can simply melt away, replaced by the color or texture that surrounds them. This Troxler fading is not a failure of attention. It is adaptation and completion working together. Stabilized patterns on the retina lead neurons to reduce their response, and in the absence of a fresh boundary signal, the brain fills the area with the most plausible background. When your tiny involuntary eye movements resume enough to refresh the edges, the features pop back. The system's bias is towards stability, and stability means accepting reasonable continuity when change is absent. The quiet fact that you normally use 2 eyes helps hide one eye's blind spot from daily life. because each eye covers the other's gap. But even with both eyes open, the machinery of completion is hard at work. Consider a set of evenly spaced vertical bars behind a slim lamppost. You do not count, then reconstruct the missing bar. You simply see a uniform picket continuing behind the post. Your brain, trained by a lifetime of natural scenes, has learned that identical elements arranged regularly tend to keep their rhythm when temporarily blocked. In the same way, a face partially occluded by a scarf feels whole beneath it. Not because you imagine each hidden feature in detail, but because the visual system represents a completed surface and lets the details remain amodal, ready to be revealed when evidence arrives. Motion finds its own version of completion in apparent motion, where two flashes in different places at the right timing make you see a single object moving between them. Nothing traveled through the intervening space, yet the brain stitches the sequence into a smooth trajectory because that is the most economical explanation. The same logic applies to more complex displays where motion seems to pass behind occluders and reappear, your mind happily tracking the invisible segment as a continuous path. In daily life, this keeps the world coherent during blinks and rapid saccades. While the eyes leap, incoming input is suppressed and remapped, and perception reports a stable scene, filling through the brief gap with expectation and memory. Expectation is a quiet partner throughout. The brain is a predictive engine, constantly proposing what should be present and measuring actual input against that proposal. Where data are thin, because of a blind spot, a shadow, an occluder, or just noisy conditions, the proposal carries more weight. That is why completion is strongest when the context is highly predictable: a uniform wall, a regularly tiled floor, a sheet of paper. Put a sharp, unexpected edge right across the blind spot, and completion can fail or produce a brief, flickering ambiguity as competing interpretations vie for ownership of the missing region. Even then, the system settles quickly, preferring the interpretation that minimizes conflict with surrounding evidence. You can play kindly with these tendencies. Draw a dotted circle with a small gap and stare at the center. With a soft gaze, the brain will often close the circle, knitting the edges across the break. Sketch a few short line segments that hint at the edges of a square. The square arrives uninvited. Place a thin grey strip across a background split into two halves of identical luminance, but opposite edge gradients. Watch an entire side look lighter than the other. None of these displays force a mistake. They invite the visual system to do what it does best: assume coherence unless proven otherwise, propagate surfaces from borders, and prefer the simplest world that explains the data. Completion is not only spatial, it is also temporal and semantic. In comics, a character lifts a hand in one panel and waves in the next, and your mind fills the motion between frames, a phenomenon artists call closure. In the same way, an object glimpsed in dimness becomes a persisting presence as you move through a room. Even when it slips between shadows, your brain continues it through time because it is simpler and safer to assume continuity than to revisit the question from scratch with every step. Vision leans on memory and prediction to bridge the places where raw input is insufficient, then happily hands control back to sensation the moment evidence returns. At a deeper level of the cortex, completion becomes richer, linking not only edges and colors, but surface material, lighting, and three-dimensional shape. A softly shaded patch beside an edge may be interpreted as a fold-in cloth rather than a change in pigment, and that interpretation spreads across the occluded part of the cloth, even when you cannot see it. Shading gradients seed expectations about curvature. Specular highlights suggest gloss. The brain carries those qualities across gaps so that when the object reappears, its reappearance feels unsurprising, already half known. That is why you can spot the same object after it emerges from behind something even when only a slice matches exactly. You have been tracking a hypothesis, not just pixels. There is comfort in how undramatic this is. The world does not need to be perfect for you to experience it as stable. The retina has its holes. Light is capricious. Objects hide each other. Fixation tires neurons. Eye movements interrupt the stream. Yet perception remains an unbroken surface, most of the time, because the visual brain is less a camera than a patient editor, borrowing a little from adjacent borders, a little from yesterday's scenes, and a little from the long statistics of the world to complete what's missing. Look for the gap, and you can make it show itself. Relax into the scene, and it disappears. Not because it is gone, but because the picture is better with it repaired, and the system that repairs it has spent your entire life learning how to make the fix look natural. Hold a small grey card against a black sweater, and it looks pale, almost silvery. Hold the same card against a white sheet, and it deepens, turning duskier than before. Nothing in the card changed. What shifted was the neighborhood, the nearby light and dark, that nudged your visual system's balances. Color and brightness do not arrive as isolated facts. They are negotiated at borders. When you look at a scene, the brain does not measure absolute light levels for each point like a meter. It asks how each point differs from its surroundings and then builds color and lightness from those differences. This means that the world you experience is shaped by contrast, by the push and pull across edges. And from that push and pull, colors and glows can appear to bloom where no pigment exists, and shadows can seem lighter or darker than any patch on a photometer would suggest, all because the code your eyes send is designed to emphasize change. At the earlier stage, tiny center-surround receptive fields in the retina set the theme. Imagine a small circular region that gets excited when light falls in the center, but is suppressed when light falls in the surrounding ring. An identical neighbor prefers the opposite pattern. Arrange millions of these little compare and contrast units side by side, each tuned to different sizes and colors, and you get a sheet of detectors that shout most loudly at edges, where the center and surround are driven differently. In a uniform field, center and surround cancel and the shouting quiets. At a boundary, they diverge and the message becomes strong. This simple architecture makes contrasts pop and, as a side effect, makes a mid-grey patch look lighter on a dark surround and darker on a light surround. The patch's center responses are compared against its immediate context, and the comparison is what climbs the visual pathway. Brightness illusions like the Mach bands ride this machinery. Place two fields of different luminance side by side with a gradual ramp where they meet, and you will see narrow bright and dark bands that aren't present in the actual light. The ramp drives the center surround apparatus into an overstatement at the change in slope, exaggerating the boundary. The cortex receiving that overstated edge treats it like a reliable contour and builds surfaces that respect it. This is helpful most of the time. Exaggerating edges makes object boundaries more stable under noise and glare. It also means that when the input contains a tidy trick, like a subtle gradient mimicking a shadow, the brain accepts it and completes the fiction, because the circuitry would rather miss a nuance than miss an edge. Color lives by similar rules, but along opponency axes. One set of channels compares long wavelengths against medium, what we perceive as red versus green. Another compares short wavelengths against the sum of longer ones, blue versus yellow. Where a reddish region meets a grey background, neurons tuned to red are relatively more active at the border, and their inhibitory neighbours dampen the signal in the surrounding grey, making the grey feel greener by comparison. Where a blue region touches grey, the grey takes on a faint yellowish cast. You can see this in simultaneous contrast displays. A grey square looks greenish on a red field, purplish on a green field, bluish on a yellow field, and yellowish on a blue field. The grey is not dying itself. The opponent balances are being gently tilted by lateral interactions across the border, and perception reports the tilt as a colour that does not physically exist in the grey. The scale of the pattern matters. When the coloured surround is coarse and the central patch is broad, contrast dominates. The centre and surround are clearly separate to the receptive fields measuring them, and the centre is pushed away in appearance from the surround's hue. But when colour is applied in a fine grid or a tightly woven pattern, the kind of fabric-like texture where coloured lines interleave with neutral ones, the effect can reverse and assimilation appears. The neutral regions seem to borrow the colour of their neighbours rather than push away from it. This Bezold-like blending happens because the receptive fields summate over small areas. The centre and surround both get a sprinkle of chromatic energy, and the system averages more than it subtracts. That is why a thin red crosshatch layered over grey can make the whole area blush slightly, while a solid red border around a large grey square makes the grey look mint. Then there are illusions where colour seems to seep into empty space, forming a soft glow that respects newly minted edges. Draw a circular arrangement of thin coloured line segments so that their ends almost connect, and across them place faint, offset white line fragments that suggest a rim. The interior of the circle will begin to appear gently tinted, as if lit from within. This neon colour spreading shows how boundaries guide the filling of surface qualities. The brain treats the suggestive white contours as a border and assigns the coloured line ends as the source of a surface hue, then diffuses that hue inward until it meets a boundary that stops it. The colour feels like a luminous mist because there is no actual pigment in the centre, only a decision about surface that has been propagated across space by circuits primed to create coherent fields when given a hint. A close cousin is the watercolour illusion. Surround a shape with a thin, light-coloured line on the inside and a slightly darker, broader line on the outside, and the enclosed region fills with a wash of the inner line's tint, sometimes startlingly so. The outer, darker contour claims boundary ownership. This is the edge. And the inner, lighter contour is treated as a surface cue that spreads across the interior. The wash is not uniform if you look closely. It's strongest near the contour and fades inward, mirroring how lateral interactions weaken with distance. The effect is asymmetric. Reverse the order of the lines and the wash diminishes, revealing that the visual system's rules for which line counts as a border and which line counts as surface pigment are not indifferent to order and contrast polarity. Your eye is not misbehaving, It is applying a stable heuristic to uncertain input. Global lighting estimates also modulate what you see. The brain is constantly separating what belongs to the surface from what belongs to the light falling on it. In a Mondrian-like collage of colored patches under a shadow, you still experience each patch as having a stable surface color, because the system infers that the dimness is due to illumination. At the same time, local contrasts tug the perception one way or another. That is why a grey patch in a shaded area can look lighter than an identical grey in direct light if the surrounding edges suggest a different interpretation. The same mechanisms that enforce colour constancy, by discounting the illuminant, can amplify or dampen contrast-based illusions, depending on which explanation makes the full scene simpler. In quiet, uniform settings, local contrast rules. In complex natural scenes, global lighting guesses keep surfaces stable even when local cues would have pushed colour around more. Divisive normalization, an elegant form of neural bookkeeping, sits under many of these effects. Neurons often scale their responses by the pooled activity of their neighbours, effectively reporting my signal relative to the average rather than my absolute signal. This makes the system robust to changes in overall light level and enhances sensitivity to structure, but it also means that a strong surround can shrink the center's effective weight or tilt its color balance. When a neutral patch is embedded in a field rich with one hue, the pooled chromatic activity biases the normalization, and the center's response is interpreted through that biased lens. You feel it as a shift in the center's color or brightness, though the photons hitting that patch haven't changed. You can touch these principles gently with a few quiet tests. Place two identical grey squares on two differently coloured sheets, one on red, one on green, and notice how each grey drifts toward the surround's opponent hue. Then print a tiny checkerboard where grey squares interleave with red, and another where grey squares interleave with blue. The grey may take on the red's warmth in one and the blue's coolness in the other, an assimilation that flips the simultaneous contrast you saw at larger scales. Draw a ring of coloured dashes, almost closing a circle, and place faint white arcs that suggest a continuous rim. Watch the interior take on a soft version of the dash colour, as if lit by neon from within. Sketch a shape with a thin, pale orange line just inside a darker purple boundary and see the interior blush with an orange wash. Reverse the order and feel the wash deflate. None of this requires strain. Look, blink, breathe, and let your eye's preference for coherent edges and stable surfaces do the painting. These experiences are not parlor tricks. They are windows into an efficient code. The world's light is messy. Shadows fall across objects. Reflections add spurious highlights. Pigments vary with texture, and the same surface can send you widely different intensities depending on where you stand. If your brain tried to store absolute values for every point, it would fail the moment a cloud moved. By emphasizing contrasts and normalizing relative to context, vision produces a representation that is both more useful and more stable. The cost is that sometimes a grey becomes a bit green, a field glows when no pigment is inside, or a contour's tiny gradient persuades you an entire region is lighter than it is. The benefit is that faces look like faces under tungsten lamps and beneath blue skies, that objects remain themselves from room to room, and that boundaries survive glare and noise. Attention shifts the balance too. When you stare directly at a center patch, you narrow the pool of normalization and increase sensitivity to its own texture. When you relax and take in the surround, the neighborhood weighs more heavily. That is why some illusions strengthen when viewed from the corner of your eye or at a distance, where receptive fields effectively sample larger areas and the brain leans harder on its edge first, surface after strategy. It is also why artists guide your attention with frames and contrasts, knowing that what surrounds a color changes the color you will swear you see. Painters speak of killing a color by putting its opponent beside it, and of making it sing by pairing it with a neutral that lets it lead the normalization pool. Everyday life is full of these gentle negotiations. A warm lamp near a cool wall makes the wall read bluer. A green plant beside a grey countertop cools the countertop's grey. A sunset floods a white curtain with gold, yet your mind keeps calling the curtain white, discounting the light while still letting some of the glow seep into your experience as a mood. This duality, constancy for identity, contrast for immediacy, is not a contradiction, but a partnership. The system holds surfaces steady enough for you to act, and at the same time lets the local context shape the scene enough for you to feel the light as it really falls. If you listen softly to what your eyes are telling you, you can sense the computation at work. A patch is never just a patch. It is a node in a network of comparisons, a participant in a small society of signals that decide together what color and brightness ought to be. From those decisions, a wash of color can appear where none is printed. A grey can lean warm or cool depending on its neighbors, and an edge can whisper enough to dye an entire field. It is the same patient strategy you've seen in brightness, now wearing chromatic clothes. Start with borders, infer surfaces, normalize by context, and let a stable picture emerge from relative differences, ready to be guided by whatever comes next. Imagine your brain not as a camera receiving a stream of facts, but as a storyteller that is always a few steps ahead, drafting the next line before the world speaks it. Incoming sensations are not raw truth. They are the world's hints, and your brain meets them with a library of expectations earned from a lifetime of mornings and shadows and footsteps and faces. At every moment it proposes, this is probably what's out there, and the senses answer back, close but adjust here. What you experience is the negotiated result, prediction updated by evidence, evidence interpreted through prediction. When data are clear, the world leads. When data are thin or noisy, expectations speak up, and sometimes they briefly write the scene themselves. You can feel this most easily in conditions of uncertainty. Walk through a fog and watch how the path ahead stays coherent, even though edges blur and surfaces fade. The brain keeps the world steady by leaning on habits. Floors continue flat unless strong cues say otherwise. Walls remain vertical. Lights come from above. Faces are convex. Objects persist behind occluders. These assumptions, priors, are not guesses you consciously make. They are compact summaries of how the world usually behaves. In the language of inference, sensation provides likelihoods. Priors provide expectations, and perception is the posterior, the best bet given both. When fog thickens, the prior gets more weight. When air clears, the likelihood wins. This economy of expectation is why so many illusions feel persuasive. A shaded oval can pop into relief because your brain expects light from above and converts a simple gradient into a convex bump. A hollow mask looks normal and bulging because the faces are convex prior overwhelms the retinal signal when the lighting and context allow. In the famous color perplexities, where a dress looks blue and black to some and white and gold to others, what differs between observers is not the pixels, but the assumed illumination. One brain discounts a shadowed scene and reports a bright fabric. Another discounts a warm spotlight and reports a darker one. Each percept is a reasonable world that could have produced the same measurements, accepted because it best fits the assumed lighting. Prediction runs at multiple scales at once. At the fine grain, early visual areas anticipate edges continuing smoothly, textures repeating, lines meeting where they ought to. At the coarser grain, higher areas anticipate objects staying themselves across glances and moments, turning with you and keeping their names. Even time is predicted. When you see a hand begin to wave in one instant and finish in the next, the motion between frames is supplied, not observed. In a flicker of apparent motion between two dots, the path you see is the brain's smoothest solution to how did the first become the second, chosen because the world prefers continuity to teleportation. Attention acts like a dial on all this, tuning not the content of expectations but their confidence, what engineers call precision. When a cue is reliable, your brain assigns it high precision and listens closely. When a cue is noisy, it lowers precision and lets prediction carry more of the story. A dim, uniform field gives little to trust, so inner models paint a stable background. A detailed high-contrast scene is rich with trustworthy edges, so the senses lead. This precision weighting happens again and again, from the retina's gain control to the cortex's allocation of attention, and it is one reason the same stimulus can look different when you are tired, distracted, or intensely focused. The weighting shifts, the partnership between prior and data changes shape. You can watch prediction enlist your own actions. Sight is not passive reception, it is an active sampling strategy. Your eye saccade 3 or 4 times per second, jumping to where information should be richest, corners, faces, words. Each jump is a small hypothesis test. If I land here, I'll see that. And the landing either confirms the expectation or produces a prediction error, a signal that something unexpected happened and the model needs a tweak. The brain uses a copy of its own motor commands, an efference copy, to anticipate the jitter that each eye movement will cause on the retina. Because the movement was self-issued and predicted, the brain can subtract it from the visual input, providing the illusion of a stable world despite the fact that your inner camera is constantly leaping. When the jump is unpredicted, your head is bumped, the subtraction fails, and the world sluices sideways, revealing how much stability depends on forecasting your own motion. Prediction stitches sound in a similar way. In a noisy room, you still hear your name because your auditory system predicts the shapes of likely syllables and sharpens sensitivity for them. When a phoneme is masked by a cough, your brain restores it and you swear you heard it. When you read a sentence with missing letters, D-Day, Bray-Day in PRK, D-Tay, CCTS, you glide through because the model of language is strong. These are not tricks. They are the system's everyday policies. Favor likely continuations, repair gaps, prioritize meaning over pixels. Most of the time, this yields a smoother, more useful world. Occasionally, the policy writes a false note. Misheard lyrics. A swapped word you would have sworn was printed, and then corrects itself the moment evidence insists. The same code that makes the world legible under uncertainty also explains why inner lights and after images can feel so present. After a bright staircase, the opponent color channels are rebalanced, and when the world turns neutral, the brain resolves the imbalance as a faint complementary glow. It is not gullibility, it is consistency. A perturbation enters the code. The predictive system interprets it as the surface that would most likely produce such a pattern. With phosphonies, a swirl of retinal activity arrives without photons. The brain's best rule is unaltered. This pattern means light, so light is experienced. When floaters move with a lag that matches fluid dynamics, the brain assigns them depth and translucency because those assignments make behaviorally useful sense. The predictive brain is not easily fooled. It is admirably consistent with its own rules. Precision offers a gentle explanation for why some days the world feels sharper and other days softer. In alertness, neuromodulatory systems tune circuits to give sensory signals more weight, shrinking the role of priors. In fatigue or monotony, the weighting tilts back toward prediction, smoothing over detail. Attention can allocate precision locally, sharpening a region of space or a particular feature like motion or color. Artists leverage this. A crisp boundary among soft gradients pulls your model toward a particular interpretation. This edge is real, and the surrounding wash is accepted as light or atmosphere rather than pigment. A filmmaker dims the soundtrack before a key line, raising precision for speech. A writer primes your expectation with a sentence structure so that when a surprise arrives, the prediction error is delicious enough to notice. There is a curious tenderness in how prediction extends beyond sensation into action. One way to minimize surprise is to revise your model. Another is to sample the world in ways that confirm it. You tilt your head to catch a highlight that will reveal curvature. You step closer to text until blur becomes letters. You touch a fabric you expect to be soft. These are not reflexes tacked onto perception. They are perception's natural continuation. The brain proposes a world and then selects movements that will either disprove it efficiently or keep it steady while you act. Even posture participates. When you expect the last stair, but the floor arrives early, your body's plan and the world disagree, and the jolt of prediction error is physical as much as visual. When ambiguity persists, perception does not freeze. It alternates between reasonable worlds, as in the Necker cube or Rubin's vase. The brain tests one interpretation, front and back assigned this way, then another. Neither wins because both are consistent with the data and with priors. So attention cycles, perhaps guided by tiny fluctuations in neural competition. This bistability shows that perception is not the data, but a choice among models that explain the data. The choice is usually unique, because the world usually tells enough of the truth. When it doesn't, the mind's willingness to hold more than one story keeps experience fluid rather than stalled. Consider how prediction safeguards identity across change. A friend waves under amber streetlights and then under the cool wash of a shop window. Pigments on the retina shift wildly, yet friend does not. Your brain factors out lighting, pose, and noise by relying on deeper regularities, ratios of reflectance, stable geometry, characteristic motion. It carries those regularities forward from moment to moment so that when a face vanishes behind a passerby and reappears, continuity is effortless. That same persistence upholds a room across blinks and saccades, across shafts of sun that move across the floor. The predictive brain is not surprised by change it has licensed in advance. You can sense the predictive weave in small, quiet ways throughout the day. Reading, your eyes land slightly ahead of where you are, and the expected next word is already lightly primed. Walking, your feet move along a rhythm that forecasts the ground, and when gravel replaces pavement, the texture error updates the gait within a step. Listening, you anticipate the end of a musical phrase, and the resolution satisfies partly because your model predicted it and was right. Even the grey of Eigengrau, the background of darkness behind your eyelids, is a negotiated truce. The brain declines to amplify every random spark and instead predicts a uniform dusk until a pattern worth believing arrives. None of this makes perception less real. It makes it more generous. A purely feed-forward system would collapse in a world of shadows and noise, forever late and easily fooled. A purely top-down system would hallucinate a dream and never be corrected. Your brain sits between, in a disciplined conversation, where prediction is humble enough to be revised and sensation is interpreted enough to be useful. The world comes to you through that conversation, smoothed where smoothing helps, sharpened where sharpness matters, completed where completion is warranted, and always ready to be rewritten the instant something truly unexpected appears. The next chapter of the scene, like the next line of a melody you already half know, is being prepared a heartbeat before you hear it, so that when it arrives, it feels less like news and more like recognition, letting you move forward with the quiet confidence of a mind that meets the world halfway. There is a moment just before sleep when the world loosens and the room behind your eyelids becomes porous. No longer a plain charcoal dusk, but a field that receives hints from somewhere in between memory and sensation. Shapes glow faintly, fragment and reassemble. Pinpricks bloom into filaments, and filaments into drifting tiles or honeycomb patterns that fold and melt like sugar in warm water. These glimmers are not quite dreams and not quite waking sight. They arrive as you pass through hypnagogia, the small harbour between wakefulness and sleep, where the brain's gates are partway open and the traffic changes character, less like steady daytime commerce and more like lanterns on a foggy quay, moving without hurry, illuminating only what they touch. As your body settles, your breath slows, and the long muscles of your legs and back release their quiet grip. Your brain's rhythms retune. The fast, task-ready chatter of wakefulness, with its scrim of alpha waves hovering over the visual cortex, begins to soften into slower, rolling theta activity. This shift is not a switch but a glide. Alpha does not stop so much as it surrenders the foreground, and in the new space that opens, loosely organized currents flow between thalamus and cortex. The thalamus, your sensory relay, reduces its precision, letting fewer sharp messages through, while the cortex, no longer tightly tethered to the outer scene, starts to talk more freely among its own areas. Perception grows more suggestible and less literal because evidence is now thin and hints are now enough. The chemistry of the night helps this along. Norepinephrine, the alerting signal from the locus coeruleus, dips. Serotonin from the RAFE nuclei eases. Acetylcholine, a messenger of plasticity and internal rehearsal, stays quietly available. The result is a system that is less vigilant yet still capable of vivid imagery. Relaxed supervision with a lively stage crew. With external channels muffled and internal ones willing, a small, spontaneous burst in the visual cortex can be read as a pale light. A ripple through shape-selective regions can sketch a face. A spark in motion areas can send a flock of dots flowing in a current you can nearly feel. None of it lasts long. All of it feels strangely authoritative, because the same machinery that normally reports the world is, for a few minutes, repurposed to report itself. Many people notice that the first hypnagogic lights are abstract. Sparks, cobwebs, faint grids that pulse with your breath or sway with your heartbeat. These echo earlier entoptic experiences, phosphenes and eigengrau, yet they are embroideries at a different level of the system. Where a phosphene might be the retina declaring itself with a nudge, these are the cortex elaborating on a whisper. The visual brain loves order. Even in darkness, it finds lattices and contours, and during hypnagogia, it is free to let those preferences play. Spirals grow, tessellations appear, and then a patch of pattern congeals for a heartbeat into the suggestion of a window, a leaf, a handwritten word you can almost read, but which, when you lean toward it mentally, becomes a pattern again. The trick is not in the object, but in the balance of top-down predictions and bottom-up support. For a moment, they agree enough to let a form appear. Then the agreement dissolves. Within this twilight, micro-dreams arrive, brief, fully formed scenes that flare and fade in a breath. A door opens onto a hallway you know. A cat crosses a sunlit floor with the exact gait of a cat you once watched. A bicycle wheel spins with the hum of spokes you last heard on a summer road. These episodes are short, often only a second or two, and they can feel startlingly specific, as if borrowed from a memory rehearsal that happened to start while you were still somewhat awake. The boundary between imagining and remembering softens here because the networks that knit together place, motion, and story, the hippocampus, parietal and temporal association areas, retain just enough coordination to flash a small narrative, then lose the thread as the thalamus slackens its grip further. Sound bends to the same rules. In the muffled room, a radiator click can be dressed in meaning and arrive as a footstep. A distant car can be cast as surf. A scrap of internal linguistic activity can unfurl into a voice that says a sentence clearly enough that you almost open your eyes to answer. Sometimes the sound is self-authored, a bright, harmless crack or pop as your auditory cortex briefly misfires in concert, a phenomenon some call a nocturnal thunderclap. It is not a danger. It is a system that, in reducing its guard, occasionally lets a coordinated burst through and then is surprised by its own restoration. As soon as you recognize the pattern and release your hold on it, it quiets, the way a ripple in a bowl settles once the bowl stops moving. There is a bodily counterpart to these lights and sounds, the hypnic jerk. As muscles release tone, proprioceptive systems that expect a certain firmness momentarily interpret the new slack as a slip, and a corrective twitch dashes through the limbs. In the imagery that follows immediately, a curb may vanish from underfoot, or a stair may arrive before expected, and the brief falling dream ties itself to the twitch and explains it. This coupling reveals how ready the predictive brain is to make a narrative. The action arrives first, the image explains it afterward, and the two feel perfectly synchronized because they are rendered on the same stage. Once the jerk is spent and the posture re-established, the story dissolves and leaves only the warmth of the next exhale. Attention changes the texture of all of this. If you try to hold the lights still and inspect them, they skitter away, replaced by the soft grey of watchfulness. If you let them approach and pass without pursuit, they grow richer, more layered, and, paradoxically, clearer. It is not compliance that opens the door, it is gentleness. As the mind relaxes its demand for certainty, weak patterns can become visible, and the brain, which would ordinarily dismiss them as noise, allows them to stand long enough to become forms. In this space, you may notice an odd asymmetry. Peripheral glimmers seem easier to see than central ones. The fovea, the center of gaze, is a task specialist. It calls for detail and evidence. The periphery is content with suggestion and motion. And in hypnagogia, it becomes the calm shore, where floating shapes are easiest to watch without breaking the water's surface. External stimuli can slip into these scenes in precisely measured ways. A draft becomes a river in a microdream. A neighbor's voice supplies a line of dialogue. A faint scent of soap drifts through a hallway that exists only for a second. Pressure from blankets becomes the memory of a backpack on your shoulders. This incorporation is not random. It is part of a nightly tuning where models of the world are recalibrated against daytime traces. The Tetris effect is the playful version, stacking blocks behind closed eyes after a long day of stacking blocks on a screen. But the broader principle is rehearsal and consolidation. The brain appears to probe its own recent experience with small, harmless simulations to strengthen what it will lay down more deeply later in the night, when spindles and slow waves take over the duty of long-term storage. Hypnagogia is like the sound check. The instruments are present, the motifs appear, and then the concert proper begins after you have let go. The thalamic gatekeeper, the reticular nucleus that wraps the thalamus, is central in these transitions. In waking, it sharpens the relay of sensory data. As sleep approaches, it starts to impose rhythmic inhibition, gently pulsing the gate so that streams of input arrive as softened bursts rather than crisp lines. In this half-gated state, internally generated patterns can enter the cortex on equal footing with external ones. And the cortex, hungry for coherence, binds what arrives into the simplest shapes that honor its own rules about edges, motion, and objects. It is not that the brain wants to dream yet. It is that, freed from having to track a room, it plays with its capacity to see whether the machinery is ready to proceed. You can explore the threshold with kindness. Lie comfortably. Let your breath settle into a slow tide, and place your attention not on a spot, but on the space just behind your forehead, where images feel like they gather. Count your exhales until counting becomes too much work, and then watch for the first appearance of a small, specific image. A doorknob, a leaf's edge, a window latch. Resist naming it. Let the edges clarify on their own, then let them go back to pattern. Notice how quickly a single edge invites a surface, and a surface invites weight, and weight invites a scene. Notice also how easily the scene can be allowed to dissolve if you meet it with the same softness that allowed it to form. If words appear, stray phrases, a line of text that writes itself, let them pass without reading them aloud in your mind. The sound of your own subvocal voice rouses the supervisory systems, and the lights dim in response. On some nights, the threshold leans toward color, on others, toward motion. This reflects subtle shifts in how your visual areas coordinate. If area V4, devoted to color, finds itself momentarily stronger in its internal coupling, washes of saturated hues may come and go like dye in water. If motion areas near the temporal lobe take the lead, grain will slide and pattern will ripple, and a field of dots may seem to flow in a steady current. Both experiences are truthful to the machinery, not to the room. You can greet them as you might greet the sea in shallow water, with your toes in the surf, not grasping at a particular wave, simply noticing that the waves have a direction today you did not impose. Occasionally, a face will look back at you. The visual system has entire constellations of neurons devoted to faces, and their thresholds are low because faces matter. In hypnagogia, these populations can be primed by memory and low inhibition and produce a sequence of faces, each arriving whole and departing quickly, like visitors stepping briefly into a doorway. They can be astonishingly vivid and yet empty of story, more like portrait studies than characters. If the presence feels too pointed, return to breath and the weight of your limbs. The system that conjured the faces is also content with the simple rhythm of a body at rest, and will turn to that signal if you present it. There is also the space where words almost before they are words appear. A sentence forms with the grammar and cadence of your own speech, but with a content that surprises you, as if overheard from the next room. This is the language network idling in free association, no longer supervised by the editor that checks for relevance. If you keep still, the words pass without consequence, like a small radio in another apartment. If you lean in, the editor returns to see what you're doing, and the radio clicks off. The art is in letting oddity register while refusing the invitation to interrogate it. In this gate, between day and night, even time relaxes. Moments stretch, then compress. You may feel that you drifted through several small scenes and then discover that less than a minute passed. This elasticity is the same you will feel again in dreams, but gentler, because the scaffolding of the room and the bed is still close. The proprioceptive sense of your body anchors the episodes. A hand still touches a sheet. A shoulder still knows the mattress. If you wish, you can place a thought, like a lantern at the edge of the field, something you'd like to remember or carry, then stop thinking it and let it sit as the waves pass. The brain in this state is suggestible, not to commands, but to simple anchors, a tone, an image, a word that will be there when you drift past it again on the way out. When the gate has pulsed enough and the thalamus commits to the night's tempo, the lights behind the eyelids either thin to a uniform dusk or blossom into the stable architecture of a dream. Either way, the harbour has done its work. It let the system idle in a way that proved nothing was urgent. Let the imagery centres warm their engines. Let the predictive machinery take a few short steps without the world's leash, and then return to heal. You do not have to do anything for this to happen. Your biology conducts it nightly. Your part is simply to notice, if noticing is pleasant, and to release, if release carries you. The glimmers are the quiet handwriting of a brain turning the page, and if you watch them without reading them aloud, they will keep writing line after line as you cross the threshold. Settle into a comfortable seat and let your breath find an easy rhythm, then bring your attention to your eyes with the same kindness you'd bring to a sleepy cat. These are gentle explorations. No straining, no forcing, always pausing if anything feels uncomfortable. The first is a simple afterimage. Find a coloured square on your phone or a sticky note. Red, green, blue, or yellow works well. And place it on a plain wall. Gaze at the centre of the colour for 20 to 30 seconds, blinking softly. Then look at an empty patch of wall. A ghost will appear in the complementary colour, as if the scene kept a quiet memory. Let it arrive and fade without chasing it. You're watching your opponent channels rebalance themselves, a little sigh of the visual system as it returns to neutral. Now try brightness instead of hue. In a softly lit room, stare at the white frame of a door or window for half a minute, then shift to a darker part of the wall. You may notice a darker negative afterimage drifting over the dimmer region, then dissolving. If you reverse it, stare at a darker object, then look at a bright page, you might see the ghost as brighter than its background. Your visual circuits amplify change. This lets tiny differences stand out and also lets brief echoes linger where nothing is actually drawn. Invite the baseline darkness to show its texture. Close your eyes. Notice that the inside of your eyelids isn't black ink, but Eigengrau, a soft, grainy dusk with a faint shimmer. Watch how it breathes with you, how it thickens when you pay attention to it, and how it thins when you simply rest your awareness and let your breath lead. If small twinkles appear, smile at them and let them go. Behind them is a steady field that tells you the system is idling, ready. Meet phosphonies with care. With eyes closed, place the lightest possible touch at the corner of one eyelid. Not rubbing, not pressing, just a feather of contact. And notice whether tiny constellations blink on the opposite side of your inner field. Release right away and rest. Mechanical nudges can coax retinal cells to fire, and the brain, which normally reads that code as light, reports a small, brief sky. Keep this exploration gentle and short. Your eyes prefer kindness over curiosity. Floaters enjoy a uniform stage. Hold a blank page at arm's length near a window and relax your gaze to a soft focus. Make a tiny, quick eye movement left or right. Slow strands or rings may lag behind, then drift back into place. Try a few more miniature saccades and watch how the shapes follow a moment later, as if swimming in a quiet current. If you look at a textured scene, a leafy plant, a bookshelf, notice how the inner silhouettes politely step back while external edges claim attention again. Let the blue sky introduce your own circulation, always safely away from the sun. On a cloudless day, glance toward an empty patch of blue, eyes relaxed and never near the bright disk. Tiny bright specks may appear near the center of your gaze, darting along wiggly paths in time with your heartbeat. If the day isn't right, a blue screen at moderate brightness can sometimes hint at the same effect. Don't force it. The sparklies prefer calm looking, and they come and go as they please. Map the quiet hole your brain so beautifully repairs. Draw a small cross on the left side of a note card and a small dot on the right. Close your right eye and gaze at the cross with your left. Move the card slowly closer or farther. At a particular distance, the dot will vanish into your blind spot. Add a thin horizontal line through the dot and repeat. When the dot disappears, the line often looks continuous, as if the world had no gap at all. You're witnessing completion at work, the brain's steady habit of stitching surfaces across missing data. Let a border fill a field with color that isn't there. With colored pencils or highlighters, draw a thin pale line to outline a simple shape, an oval or a cloud, and place a slightly darker, broader line just outside it. Look softly at the interior. A wash of the inner line's color may seep across the shape, strongest near the contour and gentler toward the center. Reverse the order of lines and notice how the effect weakens. Edges own the borders, surfaces inherit their hues. Create a gentle glow from fragments. Draw a ring of short colored dashes, leaving tiny gaps between them. On top of that ring, add faint white segments that nearly connect into a rim, offset so the coloured ends peek inward. Rest your eyes on the centre. A soft, neon-like tint may appear to float inside the ring. If it doesn't arrive, shrink the ring a little or change the background to a neutral grey. The brain likes hints that agree, and the right geometry gives it permission to spread colour into empty space. Watch grey, learn its mood from its neighbours. Place two identical grey squares on two larger sheets, one red and one green, or one blue and one yellow. Step back a bit. The grey on red may lean green. The grey on green may lean magenta. The grey on blue may warm toward yellow. The grey on yellow may cool toward blue. Now draw tiny red and blue crosshatches directly over two new grey squares so that neutral and colour alternate too finely to see separately. The grey may now assimilate some of the overlay's tint, borrowing a blush rather than pushing against it. Contrast and averaging are both part of the code. Scale decides which wins. Meet Mac bands and their cousins. Print or display a smooth luminance gradient with a noticeable bend where a ramp meets a plateau, or simply tape two paper strips of slightly different grey next to each other with a soft pencil smudge along the boundary. Look at the edge. You may see narrow, bright and dark bands hugging the transition that aren't in the physical gradient. Your center surround machinery is sharpening a slope change into a boundary. Step back and the bands grow stronger. Come close and they soften, a reminder that receptive fields have a preferred scale. Let a tiny edge repaint two broad fields. Create the Craik-O'Brien corn-sweet setup. Two large rectangles of the exact same grey touching each other, but at their shared border, draw a narrow gradient. One side ramps slightly up, the other down, meeting in the middle. When you step back, one big field can look lighter than the other, even though a sampler would measure them as equal. Borders tell surfaces how to feel. The brain trusts a convincing edge more than it trusts a meter reading it never sees. Try Troxler's quiet fade. On a screen or paper, place a small fixation dot at the center, then draw faint colored blobs in the periphery several centimeters away. Gaze at the dot and breathe. After a while, the peripheral blobs may soften and vanish, replaced by the background, only to pop back when you move your eyes. Stabilized, unchanging features adapt, and in the absence of a border signal, the brain fills in the gap with the surrounding field. Your tiny involuntary eye movements will bring the features back, like tides restoring the shore. Invite contours that aren't drawn to appear. Sketch 3 Pac-Man shapes in a triangle, mouths pointing to the center, and add 3 corner brackets that would complete a triangle if you connected them. Rest your gaze near the center. A crisp white triangle may appear to hover, its edges as clear as if you had traced them. Nothing in the center is drawn. Everything about the arrangement invites a simple, coherent surface. If you shade the background slightly, the illusory triangle can even look brighter than the paper beneath it. Find your retinal tree. In a dark room, close your eyes and hold a small, diffused light source, or the flashlight of your phone, face down against your palm so it glows gently. Sweep your glowing palm slowly back and forth across your closed eyelid from the side so only scattered light enters. A delicate, branching silhouette, your retinal vessels, can spring into view as a shadow cast on your own photoreceptors. Move the light a little and the tree slides. Pause and the veins hold fast. Keep the light soft and the exposure brief. This is a whisper-level demonstration, not a spotlight. Taste the motion after effect in a mild, friendly way. Watch a looping clip of a waterfall or a rotating spiral for 20 to 30 seconds. Moderate size, moderate contrast, no need for a minute-long stare. Then shift your gaze to a textured wall or your hand. The texture may drift the opposite way for a moment. Populations tuned to one motion direction adapted. Neutrality feels like motion in the other direction. If you feel even a hint of dizziness, stop at once and take a few slow breaths with eyes closed until everything is calm. Play with tiny saccades to see how the world stays steady. Fix your gaze on a small dot on the wall and intentionally make micro movements, barely their glances left and right, without moving your head. Notice how the dot stays put while peripheral textures seem to sway. Your brain subtracts the expected retinal slip from your own movements, preserving stability. Now gently nudge your head forward a fraction without planning it, and feel how the world's steadiness falters for a beat. Predicted motion gets cancelled. Surprises announce themselves. Let sound join the visual experiments as a partner. Sit with eyes closed and let the quiet room present a hum, the faintest appliance, a distant murmur, and imagine its source. Then open your eyes and glance around. Notice how quickly vision supplies edges that give the sound a plausible origin, and how the imagined source shifts to match the new evidence. Perception is a treaty between senses. The treaty updates calmly when new facts arrive. Set up a comfort ritual that keeps these explorations gentle. Keep the room softly lit. Sip water between trials, blink often, and pause after any experiment that feels intense. Never look at the sun, never stare at brilliant lights, and avoid hard rubbing or pressure on your eyes. If you ever notice a sudden shower of new floaters, persistent flashes in dim light, or a dark curtain across part of your vision, that's not an experiment. That's a cue for timely professional care. Gentle curiosity lives comfortably alongside sensible caution. Return to the simplest, most soothing one whenever you like. Close your eyes, feel the weight of your body, and watch Eigengrau settle into its grain. If a ribbon of color wanders through, let it. If a pattern wants to become a face and then decides not to, let it. If nothing happens at all, that is also something. Your system resting, the background calm and prepared. These mini experiments aren't tests to pass. They are small invitations to notice how a living visual system composes experience, quietly, reliably, and in real time, ready for the very next thing you decide to see.